Hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the CNB Gallery. My name is Rebecca, I'm the director of the gallery, and I have been very privileged to have Sharon as the curator, and of course Danny, for this exhibition. And now I'm going to hand you over to Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. And I'm delighted to introduce you to Danny Rolph, the artist, and Martin Holmon. And they're going to be in conversation tonight. Danny has created this wonderful installation entitled East Central, which is made up of 4 of his signature triple wall paintings. Each one which draws on the memories of growing up in a high-rise block, actually just around the corner, looking out over the views of the skyscrapers of the world beneath him. He was born in London and holds a BA Honours in Fine Art from Winchester School of Art and an MA in Painting from the Royal College of Art. He's visiting professor in Fine Arts at Bucks New University and visiting tutor at the Royal Academy Schools. He's been nominated for the Sovereign European Art Prize and Hamlin Award and received numerous prizes including the John Minton Travel Award, Delphina Trust Award, London Arts Visual Arts Award, and was a scholar at the British School in Rome. His recent solo exhibitions include Painted in the Sky at the Barbara Davis Gallery in Houston, Recollection in 532 Gallery in New York, and Essad in Valence. His work has been shown in many group shows in galleries in the UK and abroad, and is held in public collections including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Tate Britain, as well as several major private collections. He recently completed a large installation for Facebook HQ and made some works in London. Martin Holmon is a writer and art historian. He's the author of the career monographs about British artists Graham Crowley, Terry Sletch, RA, Richard Room, all published by Lund Humphreys, as well as numerous essays for magazines and exhibition catalogues. He regularly reviews exhibitions for Art Monthly, Art Review, Frieze, and other publications in Britain and abroad. He's a Londoner by origin, but now lives in Cornwall. For a couple of years, he was based in Italy, where he pursued his interest in post-war Italian art. He collaborated with several artists there whose careers emerged in the 1960s, and in this country has been closely associated with exhibitions in British public venues by leading figures from art povera, Pino Pascali, Michelangelo Pistoletto, and Gilberto Zorio. Martin has followed Danny's career for 15 years and written about him on several occasions, including for the catalogue of his one-man show in Milan in 2007. At their first meeting, they knew they were on the same cultural wavelength when they quickly established their mutual admiration for the great and now sadly late American jazz vocalist, Mark Murphy. I'm going to hand you over to Danny and to Martin.
Thank you, Sharon. And I pick up on that last phrase that was in that biography that Sharon very kindly read out about me, about music, because that was something that I think is important to you, isn't it, Danny? And it's something which I associate with you because we have a personal connection. When I go to your studio, you rifle through your LPs, and it's something that we even swap files of music, don't we? Right. Your taste, of course, is far more sophisticated than mine, which is woefully historic. Yours is more up to date. But it's something that I feel is very apposite to the way you paint. And that I was always curious as to whether you see a correlation between the way you, whether there's an influence or whether your work is informed by the interest you have in music, for instance.
I completely see music and the music that I listen to and the processes and the outcomes as completely interlocked to the fabric of what I am totally. And whether I'm actually physically listening or remembering words, harmonies, or the structure of music. It's always being played in my head or physically in the studio, as you know. So the conversation, you know, it may be snippets of conversations or snippets of music sampling, and which is a reflection of the time which I was growing up in this area, when early old school, what's now called old school hip hop, emerged and come to London in the 79, 80, and we'd listen to samples, and later on I realised that these were samples of, you know, tracks by Steely Dan or,
Sure.
you know, great James Brown and people like that.
And with my gimlet eye and surveying these very dynamic, motion-filled surfaces that you're working with, you have inserted references to funk and soul music through the covers, for instance. Tell me a little bit more about how they relate to the development of these compositions.
Well, when I thought about this exhibition, what I could do down here, you know, I was invited obviously by Sharon and Rebecca to make a show, and suddenly, you know, because this hasn't got exterior light, and I thought about the sizes and what I'd like to achieve, and to shine a light on this area, which is very much home, even though I don't live around here anymore. It's very much home for me and my family going back generations. And so I tried to remember that feeling of walking to school, going to the canal, playing with my friends, you know, messing about, getting in trouble, and around this area. And I straight away remembered how I thought when I was 14, and I tried to reconnect with that time, and the energy of London, and the energy of, like, you turn a corner in any of these great postal codes, and you see this amazing Wren church, you see this bit that was bombed out. And my uncle, who was a local historian, he told me, you know, family histories interplayed with bigger histories, and I tried to reconnect the 14-year-old boy, which isn't just about sight, because it's memory. And I remembered always sort of just loving soul, funk, fusion, and actually that was integral to what I was inside.
And you do this by incorporating actual, I suppose we call them fragments of album covers. We don't see the full album cover of any particular music. First of all, how important is it that the viewer, when circulating around this exhibition, picks up on that detail?
I think the fragmented nature of it is the most important thing, and whether they know that album, that group, is sort of incidental, and maybe it will trigger something, maybe they'll try and explore it, but it's only my history, and I like the idea of it being just a fragment. And, you know, the representation of, you know, artwork on album covers was such a integral thing. You know, I collected it as, you know, as well as, like, I would buy certain music, you know, I remember in the late 70s, very young, or early 80s, because of the album covers would lead me to the music as well.
Don't tell me you cut up the actual album covers.
Oh, I dream of it.
So where have you sourced those images from?
No, these are from my own albums, and then I had prints made of them, archival prints, and then I had them shrunk down. So that's why obviously they're not album size, had them shrunk down and cut them up. So
collage is effectively is one of the media that you incorporate into these paintings.
Yeah.
What's the significance of using collage to you?
Well, for me, it's an important component that it breaks something. It stops the language of the stroke and the arm and all the painterly traditions from being just about touch, and it's almost like just a little poke in the back, and it sort of draws us into another plane, another little world. And so, you know, they include collage fragments, and I sort of, I'm interested and I'm curious. I went to a talk last week at the Royal Academy, at the Royal Institute, and Albert Oland, who I think is a great inspiration in his use of collage. Since the 70s, using it as a slightly disruptive influence rather than just something to, fetishised. I like the way that Kurt Schwitter's obviously used collage as well. So I see it as something almost quite Dadaist, I think.
Yes. Because one of the things that I associate you probably most of all is with these different perspectives of a notion of space that which coincide, which work simultaneously in your paintings. And one of the functions that I suppose one could attach to collage, which is an image which is already in our own world, which has had different functions, is importing space from another source, importing another type of space into a painting. Is that something which is
absolutely.
you would connect with in what you want to do?
Somewhere else, but it's also a different sort of visual language just imported. And as you know, in the past, you'll see in the fabric of the paintings, there's drawings of mine from 20 years ago. There's things that I've picked up, found around on the street. There's monoprints. So that I'm very interested in the fact that this collapsing of time, this volumetric nature of time in painting can be repositioned and spoken about in a variety of ways. So, whose time is it? Is it? Do we only live our time, or are we just part of some other lots and lots of connections?
Well, let's explore that notion of time a little bit. You are probably described most often as an abstract painter. Is that accurate? Would you accept that?
I'm described as that, but I don't see it as that.
Yeah.
I've always just seen it as I start off to make a painting, and then the journey sort of happens. So.
And in terms of the association with abstraction is applied to you, I think, because that you don't have a direct representational or figurative function to the forms that you have in your painting.
That's right.
Do you welcome then one of the characteristics of abstraction is its reflexivity. It's on its own processes.
Back to music as well.
But do you welcome the possible anecdotal element in your painting? That, for instance, by using those importations from a practice or world that you occupy but isn't, which is brought into the painting, that this sets off narratives and anecdotes which are not yours alone, but which can have touchstones for other people's experiences and memories. Is that something that you welcome in your painting?
Yeah, that's something I don't want to hide from, because it's not me that would know Bootsy Collins, just Bootsy Collins, or whoever it is that I've chosen to incorporate in the collage, like Marcia Hunt or something. Everyone may have a relationship to these people, or they may just be symbols of a time, or a certain zeitgeist. So the fact that they can be connected is interesting, but not necessary.
Is not necessary.
Yeah.
But to you, in the genesis of these images, explored that imported space with its personal significance for you, perhaps setting off your own memories?
Well, this is the only time I've ever done it, because I just suddenly come downstairs, I see we don't have any natural light, and it's a basement, and I just thought this is a particular space to do something very particular, and it just felt I straight away saw what size paintings I wanted to do, and to stretch myself I knew I wanted to do 4, and then 4 related to the 4 East Central districts, which I've got such a connection with, and I suddenly thought, well, maybe I could import something that was even more specific into each element that connects it with me. And as you know, there's an element in each painting that connects it.
No, that surprised me because that you introduced an element of autobiography in, as it were, into, for instance, into these paintings. Well, we've got one behind you. Yeah. Now, this is something which that again isn't essential that people who look at the painting, the viewer picks up. But do you want to just say something, perhaps in relation to this painting, as to how, as to what that is, and then how it informs the composition?
Well, the actual element which relates to each postal district is only very, very incidental. It may be very specific. In this one, it's the St James's Church in Clerkenwell, where I was christened. Yeah. In this one, the EC4, there's an image of Fleet Street, where my father was a printer, and it's a photograph from the 19th century. Because I thought, well, why use something from now? In EC3, there's a reference to Pudding Lane, obviously with the Great Fire. In EC2, there's which you spotted straight away, the little reference to Wesley's Chapel, which was opposite my school at Old Street Roundabout, and Bunningall Cemetery. And so these things only come in later on after a brushstroke. They weren't the sort of the impetus which the brushstrokes were built around. So it was just a hunch, like everything else. I don't plan anything. I just, apart from the sizes and the materials, and then I'll get going. And it's the sort of for this show was a specific reconnection with each district, and that's the first time I've done that.
Does it surprise you that you explored something personal in that way?
Yeah, and I'm surprised by how different it is to my actual memory. Because it's filtered from the distance of 30 years, 30 odd years.
These titles which appear under the paintings, but we know this exhibition has that essential sort of theme generally to it. These titles are quite specific. Now, you always title your paintings. You never use the get out of untitled. No. And in the past, we've had prime ministers, we've had football managers, we've had Jet Taylor Quartet, and other sort of rather eclectic choices of music makers. We've had phrases like palazzo, mimo, and whatever, which refer to
famous Italians.
But you don't use those. But those titles in the past have not been ways into the paintings themselves. Right. Kind of like a form of handy studio identification. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so by putting a postcode, remember what is a postcode as well? It's just something very. It's a topographic thing, but it's also an historical thing, and then in particular, the postcodes here have a deeper resonance to the fabric of what I am, which I see through, from my children and through what I choose to do. It's just something so particular about EC1, EC2, EC3 and EC4 and my own that feels rooted, it's sort of almost 10 miles down. It just feels absolutely that I'm the clay. I don't know why that is, and I've always felt that. It's not something new, it's not sort of a nostalgia thing. I've always felt that.
Yeah.
And also the East Central was also a pun on, South Central, like rappers talking about how tough South Central is. You know, EC3 and EC4 aren't that tough, are they really? We can be. Black Monday.
Because another perspective of the kind of space that you seem to open up from the surfaces of your paintings is, and this is not new, I mean it's something which I've seen in your painting for more than a decade, is this kind of like what I would call perhaps almost a more psychological, a more sort of psychogeographical element, which is quite general, but which picks up, but which animates the painting through associations that are communicated to the viewer in terms of a sensual experience, perhaps, which might be urban, or of emotions that might pass through us, which are communicated through your manipulation of line, colour, form, and space. Those abstract elements in a painting. Do you want to say something more about that in terms of the intentions within you have for the way you make your paintings?
Well, I think that's really well observed, because I go into the studio and I mix colours, and colours lead to forms which suddenly have connections. They're neural connections for something maybe I've read, something I've witnessed. As you know, I go and research in all across Europe, whether it's in Siena, whether it's Amsterdam, Madrid. In the age of EasyJet, we can get to these places for peanuts and spend time in front of the work. A series of works I did for the show in New York last year was prompted by just going back to the new Rijksmuseum and studying Vermeer's Love Letter and picking up on certain elements that I had no idea about, because in reproduction we see the central third, and actually to the right and the left of this painting we see the artist's studio, we see the ephemera, the things that in reproduction you see the lady reading the letter and the maid looking over, and then we see this beautiful tiled floor, the light coming in. And actually to the left and right of the painting as we look at it, there's the back of the artist's studio, there's boxes, there's his shoes, and all of these other things, like in Las Meninas, painting the artist painting the studio, or Matisse's Red Studio. It really interested me, all of the things that we have around us, and why not put a few of these elements in? So that was prompted, so going to see places and feel and experience was incredibly important to how I then embarked on those paintings. These paintings, if you look, there's a purple sort of looping line which sort of activates across all four paintings, which is spending a lot of time in Venice at the Scuola Grande di San Rocco, where all the great Tintorettos are on the ceilings, on the stairways, 54 or 59 paintings, and the way the force of the determination of the arm, the stroke, and it's not a fancy, glamorous stroke. It's the determination to keep us moving, and that was the trigger at a certain point to bring that through in these paintings. I remember the trail of, I love the urgency in Tintoretto, to get the thing done, and you can see it. And it's drawing with a brush, it's drawing through and drawing out energy.
Go on.
No, it's just about like years ago when we looked at that James Rosenquist F111. Do you remember what that used to be in Deutsche Bank in London? And we just spent time, and I loved that sort of fragmented energy, and urgency to get this message to us quickly, but then you can slow down and it reveals, deeper subtext.
Yeah, exactly. But what you just said there also reminds me of this, yet another kind of like perspective that you seem to express in your paintings, perspective on space, which is this one where, there's kind of, which is, we could call it temporal in terms of your sources, in which, that there are these colours which you could say derive from history, but this is not often very immediately apparent to the people in the studio. You manipulate those, but these colours also, in the way that they are presented, have a very contemporary feel, almost as they come from an environment that we've passed through, perhaps, in order to come to the gallery. The high street, the ones that we, the places that we go down in a hurry on our way to work. They have, the urgency of those artists that you mentioned, but also the urgency of modern marketing, and they have a kind. Some of these colours have a synthetic quality. That impresses me. Now, and that communicates. Is that also a source
Absolutely.
of your?
We see sort of burger wrappers.
Yeah.
You go past Primark.
Yeah.
You go past a Missoni shop. Let's forget about the sort of economic values. Let's talk about the discussion between visual values, and then also we could walk through cities, and often we're seeing reflections. Hence this is why I started to work on this material 18 years ago.
Yeah.
Especially now, we go through cities made of glass, and we may see the grid where the glass meets. And basically what we're doing is looking at a version of what's behind us most of the time. So we're incorporated into this. So it's not a conscious thing, but it's a subconscious thing that actually we get a sense of ourselves all the time, visually. And that is connected through, because I don't have any hierarchy about materials or about where you're lifting this from. So it could be a Tintoretto stroke, but it could be the Burger King wrapper, or it could be, the album cover. But it's a particular, it's always very particular colour that leads to the shape, which leads to the connection for me. And then this thing, this situation evolves over a period of time where I think someone was asking the other day, the old question of when do you know it's finished, and which all of us artists have asked a lot, and it's a valid question, and I think I just said it's when I don't understand the painting anymore, because we're so familiar, I think, with what we do, with what we are, and we think we're that familiar, and actually when we get to a point where it tips over that line into a question, and it gets you curious, then that's the space, and that's when it stops.
Develop that if you can.
Well, I remember reading something about de Kooning by Richard Schiff, about when he's getting to the bottom of de Kooning's paintings, and how and how doubt is embedded in the process, which I totally understand. Embracing doubt as part of the creative process for me is incredibly important. And de Kooning was asked when when the painting was finished, and he said, "When I stop," which sounds flippant, but actually, it's not, because each day, he'd paint and wipe off, paint and wipe off, paint and wipe off. So what we're seeing, it happens to be that day, which is also an embodiment of all the other days in which it's been wiped off. And that's a really interesting space. It's just where things are left. I had the privilege in Houston a few weeks ago of meeting this amazing woman who was de Kooning's lover, and she, in the late 60s and early 70s, and she still got all these wonderful paintings around her and drawings, and it wasn't like a presentation, these were like mirrors on her time with him, and you can tell that he was the love of her life and vice versa, apparently. And it was, there's this trembling urgency of which I pick up on these surfaces of to see something he hasn't seen before. I know that's to quote from Matisse, and I just love that journey and where he chooses to stop. And this experience that leads you to that, for me, is when I stop understanding the work, and that's the point where the questions start. And because I'm the viewer of the work as well, the first viewer, not the best viewer, just one viewer.
Well, that's the sort of going towards the end point, the image that we see. Let's roll that back and say that drawing is at the core of your practice.
Absolutely.
And I remember you said, when we were talking, this would be some years ago, that you had a practice of starting every day with drawing.
Yeah.
You always carry a notebook.
Yeah.
You still do.
Yeah.
And you used to have a practice too of making a certain number of drawings. It always seems quite ritual. These these continue.
On train journeys.
and that so the drawing is at the core.
Yeah.
And you've said that you don't plan.
No.
So one of the most terrifying things for any maker is moving towards the next picture, or the next thing that needs to be written.
It's Beckett, isn't it? You know, fail and fail better.
Yeah. So what's the start? So the generative point comes from remembered gesture.
Yeah. The drawing, whether I'm on train journeys, you remember those line drawings when I'm in the studio putting things together. It's a body thing, and the eye is like a muscle, and needs training and organisation of space and touch and trying things out across canvas, across plastic, across papers, in collage. There's no sort of, like I said before, no material hierarchy. So that to make a mark and then to develop that mark is incredibly important to me, and what I respond to in other artists' work, whether it's in the past in Pollock, whether it's Poussin, whether it's Tintoretto, or in contemporary, really good work like Albert Oland, Laura Owens, people like that. I always feel that there's something that I'm drawn to, whether it's de Kooning, that this drawing with a brush or this fine line, these decisions, is the core. I don't know what. I think drawing is just this primal thing, and actually, I think all of these, I see them as drawings in paint. I don't see a separation between drawing and painting. And like I don't see a separation in Tintoretto's. What's being drawn is what's being painted.
And would you say that through this practice of drawing has any kind of personal vocabulary of forms grown up?
Oh yeah.
Almost a cosmology.
Absolutely.
It's
slow as well. It's slow.
Pace.
One of the privileges of making paintings is that it's informed by everything else, and it has this incredible, unique slowness that you can spend 5 years holding a brush like this and then realise that actually it would have been better like that. And actually, to people that don't make work, that may seem truly bizarre, but actually any of us that do, it's a slow life that is periodically there's little sort of water bombs that go off of excitement and it's a curious thing. So actually the activity isn't therapeutic, it's a passion to see things I haven't seen before.
And repetition is something that you can make use of.
You can't avoid it. If you think of Matisse, drawing the leg of a table, and just seeing something recently in MoMA, just seeing a table leg. And what was so beautiful, I was walking around with a friend, and he said, how did he get that so right? And I said, well, it's 20 years of drawing that line, and it's the body, the mind memory, the muscle memory. and he can get it right because he's done that for so long, and it's just there, and it's a familiarity. So it is slightly repetitious, but it's never going to be the same. That arm on each day, like de Kooning, is going to be a different arm. We're a day older, a day more experienced,
and that carries significance. The making of the mark, and that carries you forward into the composition.
It's not about the fetishisation of the mark as well for me. You know, it's not, and sometimes, you know, marks are emblematic of marks. So I think that sort of...
Say more about that. Go on.
Well, you know, like you think about, you know, post, say, Roy Lichtenstein painting the brushstroke.
Yeah.
You know, it's a brushstroke. We name it as a brushstroke. It obviously is made up of brushstrokes, but it's an emblem of a brushstroke. So in the past, when I you know, sometimes like you can see in that one around that lady, there's swirls, or maybe down the bottom like those black and teal strokes. Yeah, they're strokes, but they're as much emblematic of brushstrokes. They represent brushstrokes, as well as activating a certain area, you know, enabling the blue to do what he wants to do. So it's a curious thing for artists of like generation, a few of the guys here, you know, that, you know, for me, you know, like as a student, you know, the painters that were being pushed towards us and they were in the foreground in magazines and everything was especially German painters, Richter and Polka, or Baslitz, and I felt always felt closer to someone like Polka.
Yeah. Where
there's humour, there's material investigations, and there's a sense of sort of the unpredictable happening as for the viewer as well as for, I imagine, the artist to have felt. So yeah, that's where that's going.
You don't make preparatory drawings before approaching, for instance, when you work on plastic. I mean, we should say you don't exclusively work on this plastic sheet. These plastic sheets. You also work on canvas. That's a different. That is a singular extensive surface when it's on. When you're working with canvas,
and it's saturated.
Using oil, using acrylics, a combination of materials in that sense. But when you work on plastic, you're able to use collage and to incorporate paper. But of course, you're working on more than one surface. Yeah. So you have a surface. You have typically you combine how many layers of twin wall?
Two layers of twin wall. Yeah. So there's 4 visual planes: the front and the back, and then the front and the back.
And twin wall again, for those who don't know what twin wall is, it's used in construction.
That's right.
It's a lightweight but robust structural material.
That's right. And it
has these distinctive linear appearance, which is made up of the chambers, which are.
That's right. So it's used primarily, obviously, in sort of conservatories, but since the late 90s, it's been used with different varieties, you know, in structures that were being built in Germany, Japan, and we see it in London, like come a bit later in the Laban Centre in Deptford, and so it's a material like anything else. But what struck me from when I first saw it in the Roman hardware shop was its my potential to write a letter to myself in paint. I could paint on the front, the back, the front and the back. So there was always an unpredictable conversation, almost like Paul and Nancy.
And it gives you a physical space that you're working within.
Yeah.
This kind of rather curious, ambiguous sort of shallow, almost. I mean, sometimes I think it looks almost aquatic space. But also what it has, because with any of the paintings that we're looking at, you have the surface where you are working on the frontal surface and on the reverse, and on the area behind, and that's that again, front and back, so that we see both the front. We see the front of a stroke, and we see the back of a stroke. What is this? So, tell me more about that significance of front and back. Front and back.
Well, it's the impression of
the expression of the phrase.
Yeah, that's right. The impression of the initial expression. So, you know, an expression being a mark, then it's flipped around. It's an impression of that mark, isn't it? Which I first encountered when I was lucky enough to be a Rome scholar. I was in my atelier in Rome, and the first few days I was there, I was just doing drawings on really thin paper that somehow you could only get in Europe back in.
What medium were you using on the paper?
Felt tip.
Felt tip
Primarily, and other markers, and I left them on the table, and then overnight, because it was early September, Rome still hot, left the windows open, woke up in the morning, of course they was all blown onto the floor, and it struck me there and then that actually what was more interesting was what was on the flip side, and I thought, that's it, that's actually what I need to do. Went to this hardware shop thinking about glass, thinking about perspex, the logical things to paint on the front and the back, and I thought glass was too loaded with history and too heavy and too fragile and too greasy, and then I thought perspex, but it bends too much, and then so I had no idea about this material, and in the hardware shop I see it and that's it, that's it, you know, with these lines running through it, just added a layer of poetry to the material for me, and I loved its prior industrial purpose because of my earlier sort of interest in especially sort of minimalist practices, and this truth to material maxim, which I was engaged and still interested in, but also wanted to destroy as well because it bored me.
Yes, and so that because I don't. We can never eliminate the influence of history on the way that you work, but but as you said then, you know, you are. You came up in the generation of the 80s and 90s, and there was still this importance of truth materials, of minimalism, and so on, and that plastic had no. Well, taking on a material like that, I mean, who do you refer to in terms of models that should you need a model to refer to?
I think Polka's use of different surfaces, you know, whether you've stitched fabric, pouring, banned chemicals onto the work. I remember seeing a great series in Paris as a student in about 1989 at the Museum of Modern Art, using substances that were banned in lots of countries, and so there was a sense of entropy in the work, so they was degrading, breaking down, and I was very interested in you can make paintings with this stuff as well, and then resin, and seeing that in Julian Schnabel's breaking in the picture plane, you know, with plaster, with cracked plates, with army tarps, boxing canvases, and I didn't want to use it just for this, to use another surface for the sake of it. It had to be something that was pertinent to me and allowed my work to take on a different path as well. So it's half the time spent working on this, half the time on canvas. There, Lucas sees it in the studio. It's always discussions across different surfaces.
The personal touchstone is important for you, isn't it?
Yeah.
As a source of the marks you make, the imagery that you compose. That it's not simply procedural.
No.
It has. It is about. These paintings have a definite personality, in a sense.
Yeah.
It is your personality in part, but we don't need to know that.
Yeah.
And that there is this element in which it's quite calligraphic. It's almost like you are, as a form of communication.
Well, what I like about Kandinsky's work is, that sort of retracing of mark, touch, memory, even like those great paintings of Cossacks, or, how things interweave into and out of time. I thought that was a fantastic show a few years ago at the Tate of Kandinsky. We've also, all of us that are trained in O-level, A-level art history and through art college, I love the Georgia O'Keeffe exhibition as well. I think that was a real revelation in showing us that actually she wasn't just this. We've only got a few representations, and Kandinsky wasn't just this. And actually, there's so much to learn from these people. I was lucky enough to visit Georgia O'Keeffe's house in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and 4 years ago, and it just blew me away, like being in Santa Fe, going to the museum, seeing the watercolours and the intensity, which unfortunately they didn't show enough of the watercolours. I thought maybe they wouldn't allow them to travel. But being in a courtyard on a blistering hot day, and Albuquerque's about a good 3,000 foot above sea level, and just being in this courtyard and seeing the adobe walls, which was built in the 16th century, and then just seeing this gap, this rectangular gap, the intense blue of the sky, the adobe wall, this rectangular gap. She paints that, and you see the strip at the bottom, and it's really interesting, that sort of migration. Actually, that was painted 100 years ago next year.
That's quite,
And it was just like and I'd seen this image, totally familiar with this image for, most of my life. I've been interested in art, and then actually being in the courtyard and I'm seeing it actually there on a similar sort of situation. Yeah,
because O'Keeffe was quite a technician in her understanding of the materials and in the effects that she allowed those materials to have.
Yeah.
Same could be said about you. I mean, in the range of material, for instance, media that you use and how you use it, that you incorporate, for instance, different textures in the way in which a mark is made.
That's right.
Can you say more about that, why that's important? For instance, the way you have broken up strokes, you have continuous strokes, you have diagonals, you have
like patterns.
Exactly. You scratch into the acrylic to have a different texture. You incorporate. Again, this where you bring in textures from material that you found, tape that you found, and so on. Can you say more about that variety and what that signifies within the painting, within the space of the painting?
I think it sort of breaks up the.
For instance, you've got a step. Sorry, tape there. That yellow band in the painting there has the after image of stars, which I imagine comes from some sort of tape that you had, or was it
one of these little craft?
Oh, one of those craft things. Yes.
Yeah.
The different ways in which you can make a mark, the different appliances that you use. It's not just brush or whatever.
I think
it's actually using a number of different instruments.
What's exciting and what's to hand to break up the sort of the particular. It could become quite monotonous. So I actually like translucent strokes against opaque strokes, like the purple in that one, for example, next to that very opaque grey, it just floats over, so it reveals what's underneath as well. And I like those jumps, and maybe that is so, looking really up close at different, painters and their pentimenti, the underpainting, and how they get to a certain point. I love Matisse paintings, for example, Piano Lesson in Momo. It's a really incredibly cruddy painting.
Yeah.
And yet, graphically, it looks so pure, and it's heroically sort of full of decisions and indecision and, you know, workings out that I like that. I like that all the workings out are apparent. And these, everything, how I get to that finished state is apparent. So
But the marks, and where the marks becomes that they have a sort of metaphoric life. They transformed in that way.
Absolutely, and you know, it's curious that, you know, when you look at those great Van Dyck paintings who I absolutely love. There's a painting of Van Dyck's in the Rubens house in Antwerp, which is a very sort of showy painting of him as a young man. Traditionally, you know, like the artist doing a self-portrait to show their skills in order to get patrons. So it's 3/4 profile, and what's beautiful is the copper ground, which I subsequently looked into because I see there was a copper line going there to there on his jawbone, and the painting was built around it, and he's looking at us in you know, in some sort of fashionable garb, but he's looking at us, and it's beautifully painted. But what was fantastically revealing to me, that this copper, which is also the light of the room, was also the underpainting. And so that was the beginning and the end. And it just, this recognition, when you see things like that, you know, of a different sort of touch. It was a very liquid sort of surface.
Is there any sense when you, because you hear layering has a sense of time and of progression.
Yeah.
Is there a sense that the lower layers are underpainting, preparatory to what you see, or are they equal to but slightly obscured by what comes afterwards?
I think the second part.
Yeah.
You know, they're definitely not background. They're just the situation that's further back.
Things that we can only glimpse and see. There's a temporal element in that.
Yeah,
things
maybe
that
it's
we
a
pass.
hum.
Yeah.
You know, and you know,
a sound. I like that.
A sound, yeah. You know, growing up, you know, in the time I grew up, you know, in the advent of video, and you know, video's thin space, you know, the screen, you know, and painting in relation to that, and the fact that we can see reflections is also very important. That, you know, going into arcades playing Space Invaders and seeing the reflections of the other machines and the noises. So this cacophony, and through this cacophony you have to focus on whatever you're doing, whether, in my case, drawing, but in other kids' case, you know, playing machines.
I mean, just finally, I mean, go back to history. I mean, has history been to you, has that been where you have found ways of organising this spatial complexity? Has history been almost like
history's almost been
the crucial guide?
As you know,
we've talked about Matisse and Leger in the past. We've talked about.
But it's not just art history. You know, for me, you know, as you know, always been interested in history as a kid, and you know, as O levels and A levels, and was offered the.
Did you do art history at school?
Yeah. And
A level?
Yeah. Sitting in Islington College in Pitfield Street, actually, just around there. And history, and you know, also reading about Eric Hobsbawm, you know, putting history into perspectives, you know, and Peter Ackroyd, and all of these great communicators. So like that, anything we do doesn't just come out of a vacuum, you know, and it's everything's within a context. So that's as much information as informs me as much as obviously standing in front of the work and researching the work.
I have to admit that I'm actually surprised by all the references that art historical references that you throw into. You know, Tintoretto, De Kooning, this is the last thing I would have thought when I was looking at your pictures. And in fact, it's Kandinsky that I had in mind when I first sort of, you know, especially that you mentioned music, which was very close to Kandinsky.
That's right.
And also the colors and the strong delineation and line that I can see in your pictures.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure whether I have a question, but
an observation.
Actually, how important was Kandinsky and all the, you know, sort of early abstraction, if you like, that kind of geometric abstraction. I'd rather see geometric abstraction than abstract expressionism in your paintings. I don't know.
No, I agree. If Kandinsky, O-level and A-level, and Mondrian, and the idea of Mondrian sort of, every time he changed his room, moved his room around, his studio, he would not paint for 6 weeks, or if he then made a mark, then he'd move his room around for 2 weeks. And so it's almost like this strange dance going on, that the painting is being activated in the room and being activated by the space itself as much as it's being activated by him and his touch. And Kandinsky, just that sort of odd bundles of energy. I always see it like sort of, beautiful tumbleweed, just sort of migrating across these surfaces and locating really interesting parts of his, history, what was happening in pre-revolutionary Russia, and to, what's happening over the horizon. So those, in particular those, and Leger, I really like, and Braque. And Braque, I think, is something we didn't mention. So, in early sort of 20th century work, Braque's touch, using sand, glass, and that focused inquiry, driven primarily by drawing and fracturing. I don't know if you've seen, there's a wonderful photograph of Braque with 18 easels, and apparently he had 18 palettes, and he would just do one mark, put that down, go to the next one, do another mark. And so it's as much to do with their activity and how they did it, as much as what they created as well.
When you were making these, did you have them all going on at the same time, and going and referring between, from going from one to another?
Yeah, all the time, and working on other work as well. I like that idea of that sort of permanent state of distraction is actually quite. We can forget, all our other things, that we carry around with us, and we can just genuinely, for me, that's the creative state, to embrace the doubt, like I was saying, and and it's okay to fail, because you can always rectify it or fail better next time. Mecca?
Yes. Danny, last week I saw you in front of the table of Vietnamese ministers.
Yeah.
And I didn't get the chance to stay, but what I found amazing, and I hope you don't think this is too brazen of me, but what I thought was amazing was you describing the painting, you were moving in front of it. And would you mind talking me through the way you did to a group of people who didn't speak English?
Well, it's very strange having a little dance with him as well.
I love the way you were moving through it, and I only got a glimpse of it. I would love us to.
I think it was the Vietnamese cultural minister.
I'd like to see that too.
Well, he spotted.
We had 20 Vietnamese ministers who didn't speak any English, and Danny was taking them through the works.
Yeah, and I only got a snippet of it.
They loved it.
What's amazing about, obviously, I'm talking on a very, this gallery has always been about breaking down the barrier of high culture. And I've always chosen artists who do that. And to see Danny talking through a piece of his without language was quite amazing. So I'm wondering if we could all kind of watch Danny talk through.
I can't reenact anything. But what was funny was that the prompt, actually going back to what Martin was saying earlier, that the cultural minister noticed Rick James in these red boots up there. In the top, on the left one, top of the
You may have to
picture.
get over there.
Yeah, above the yellow and turquoise. And he noticed it, and he went, Rick James, and then he started doing some sort of dance like this. And so I thought, oh, why not? So I've just done that with him. And the translator and everyone was just like looking, like thinking. But the thing is, if that was a method of communication, if you've got the facility to see, you've got the facility which we're privileged to have, if you have.
Yeah.
You've also got this connection to connect with your own experience. Obviously, his memory, he knew who Rick James was. He's from Vietnam, and he was over, and he didn't speak any English. I know who Rick James is, and there's a connection. We live in a proliferation of visual culture, and and obviously in YouTube time, we can access this, can't we? And I think it was, what art can do, and we can slow things down in art, rather than constantly sort of this unending sort of discussion going on. We can actually freeze frame things and just keep them suspended in a moment. And
slow it down to make use of, in terms of imagery, or slow it down to comment on something about the world in which we live in at the moment?
Well, maybe it's a bit of both. Maybe it's a bit of both, because obviously everything a painter or an artist does is particular to them. But also, I do think if it's genuine, it's always connected to its time. That's a personal feeling, when we see works that, sort of like battle scenes, in which there was a lot of battle scenes painted by quite academic artists in the 18th century and early 19th century. They always look so stilted because they were sort of painted a long time after, and then the person wasn't there. And and it's the opposite of, say, someone like Georgia O'Keeffe painting that courtyard, and you feel it there, but it in its abstract integrity, we're there, but it also stands for something else in its own right graphically.
I'm aware of a certain kind of this layering on the twin wall, although it makes you have this incredibly fluid sense to the shapes. You're also made aware of a certain formality, that you become aware of the separation between those layers. That reminds me just slightly of almost like the at times the stage flats on an opera set, or something. And I wondered if you ever do sort of slide things apart and relayer them, or the rear layer always remains the rear layer, and that there's always a sort of hierarchy in that sense.
No, I do. The way I attach them, I can then take them apart and put things in. Actually, just the other day in the studio, Alonso was there and was listening to Patti Smith's Horses, and I just bought they'd just done a reprint, and it was in a bottle green colour, and I just took it out of the sleeve and I've put it into this new triple wall painting. So it becomes obviously a green circle, a bottle green circle, but it's also the potential for it not being a record anymore, and the cultural resonance of what I think was a fantastic album. And it sort of, that's gone into like a space sandwich between not on the surface and and then subsequently that informed a few more marks. So yeah, it does happen. There's no hierarchy because it's the back that it has to stay sort of perfectly as the background, like what Martin was saying. There's an interplay that can all change at any point. And just one last thing, what I like is the idea of this almost being the moment of emergence of a certain situation, or maybe it's the moment just before everything collapses and lands on the bottom of the visual plane. So it's just this hopefully euphoric moment. I like there to be a lot of energy about this situation, but maybe it's emerging, or evolving, or maybe it's just evolving back towards a state of affairs where everything was just.
Yeah, I mean, I think they exude a state of potential, huge potential, in the imagery that, without resolving into anything that represents.
Yeah, I don't want them to be ambiguous as well. I want them to be very specific, but like you say, the potential is in the specific. I think.
Since you started using this material, and earlier you mentioned that you still work on canvas, do you still work a lot on canvas, or do you feel like learning?
About half the time.
So in the concept of like this layering or like creation of depth,
Yeah.
obviously I can see a reliance upon the material to
Yeah.
create that with these.
Yeah.
How do you take that back into a more opaque surface? And is it, before you're talking obviously about the layering or the removal to then create space, the removal to reveal,
Yeah.
is that something you do? Or, yeah, I'm just interested how you take it back into one solid surface. And,
Well,
yeah.
with on canvas, obviously, you saturate in, and I start with a very saturated blues, pinks, yellows, because I think a lot about the sky. And growing up in the Tower Block, you spend a lot of time in West Texas, New Mexico, or in New York, and just being in skies or in aeroplanes.
it's funny you say skies, because when I was thinking about it, I was almost on a reverse that. I was imagining
Yeah.
more looking into water. And we were talking about another study,
Yeah.
Samara Scott, and the way that she worked that
Yeah.
idea of like put that surface and then delving deep down into something that's.
Well, actually, I've always really liked it since I was a kid. You know, I love swimming, but especially in the sea, and going to the bottom and in swimming pools and looking up.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I do think I've always been like not looking down or around, but looking up. So if you're picking that up, that's actually really pertinent actually. And getting back to the language of the sky, you know, so that becomes, it's much more. There's this situation, there's this saturated situation upon which these elements like this. There's an example, or 4 examples upstairs, and a few small works where they're built upon rather than put, but they're removed by being painted over and repositioned. So it's not quite the same. It doesn't, but it's incredibly similar. There's the same purpose and the same sort of grammar of signs are at play.